So I've had a few people recently ask me about improving vocabulary as a writer, and because I have no energy to do my philosophy homework on free will, I will be doing this video instead. And by the way, you probably will hear every street noise in my neighborhood because I am on a busy street, and I have no idea how to get my phone to not absorb every sound in the universe as I record. I'll have to ask some people about that. So I have lived in Korea for about 4 years now, and not only have I not learned any Korean, but I also have lost a lot of my English. And so you might be thinking, well, how is that possible? Aren't you supposed to learn Korean by immersion because you live in the country? Nope. I speak 100% English at my job. If I go to the store, all I have to do is hand them my credit card. The only thing I really need is Hangul, so I can read menus and basic signs, things like that. But I don't really have to learn the language here because everything is so English accessible. As for my English vocabulary, when I'm speaking, I'm usually simplifying it so I can get my message across very easily. Because of the language barrier, I try not to use any sort of complicated English vocabulary. My purpose is usually to communicate well with whoever I'm talking to. It's not in order to have some sort of academic debate or anything like that. I think everyone should be able to communicate clearly with whatever vocabulary they have. Good communication is much more important than being the most eloquent person in the room. It doesn't really matter what you say if nobody understands it. But the downside of simplifying my English for communication purposes is now my English is losing. I don't think my English was that great before, to be honest. I think I just spoke in a lot of slang and regional dialect, but it's been harder and harder to keep my vocabulary or learn new vocabulary. And quite frankly, Koreans seem to know more vocabulary than I do. I picked up a book of English vocabulary for Korean speakers, and I didn't know half the words in there. But on the other hand, my writing hasn't suffered very much at all. The way I write and the way I speak are completely different. And so I'll use probably more advanced vocabulary in my writing just because it's a necessity. So this video is more for improving your vocabulary as a writer. The big difference between speaking and writing is that when I'm speaking, you can see my body language, you can hear my tone of voice. When you're writing, it's a lot trickier because people can't see you, they can't hear your tone of voice. And so you have to have the right vocabulary to clearly express what you mean. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to improve your writing vocabulary. Now, the first tip might seem really obvious. Read. What isn't obvious, however, is what you should read. You might be expecting me to say, well, you should read the genre you write in, but actually I don't recommend doing that. The thing with that is that you've already been reading the genre that you write in for a long time, probably. So if you're a fantasy author, you've probably read every Harry Potter book like 17 times, and you've read Lord of the Rings, and you've read this and that. If you're a young adult fiction writer, you've probably read the billions of young adult fiction books there are. If you're a romance writer, you've probably read piles of romance books. So you already have that vocabulary. You don't need to keep reading the same genre because you've already gained all the vocabulary you can gain out of those genres. There's actually 4 places I recommend gaining new vocabulary by reading. One of those is going to be a journal or magazine. So the job of journals or any magazine in general is to get across a lot of information in a very small space. So every article you see, every advertisement you see is going to have very selected vocabulary in order to get its message across as quickly as possible. So this means that all the verbs they use, all the adjectives they use, adverbs, whatever, they're going to be hella solid. Now, personally, I'm a fan of the Wall Street Journal. One, because they have really interesting stories about entrepreneurs and businesses and things like that. And I find stories about people and businesses actually extremely interesting. If you really want an interesting story, you should look up the history of Gucci. There's a hitman involved. But anyways, I digress. Also, the Wall Street Journal just has some sexy adjectives. So what I usually end up doing is I grab one of these magazines and I go through each of the articles and choose vocabulary that maybe I forgot about or I haven't used in a while, and I will jot these down somewhere. Usually I'll use like Notion, or I'll just keep the magazine in my bookshelf and look at it periodically. Sometimes I'll jot them down in a notebook, or I'll make a short little scene with it. Anyway, that you actually review it is best. I actually have Korean journals full of Korean words, but I never look at them, and so it's completely useless to me. My vocabulary hasn't built because I haven't reviewed it. So you have to choose a system that's best for you to review. For me, the only way I review any vocabulary is by reading consistently in the same kind of topics and things of that sort, writing in the same sort of topics. Reading is the only way I review. It's the only way my brain stays engaged. I cannot read lists of vocabulary words. It drives me insane. The second text you should read is poetry. So along the same lines as journal, poetry has to get across a lot of information in an extremely small space, even smaller than magazines. And on top of that, poetry has to give you imagery. So poetry also has to get across all of the emotions of the writer, and it has to paint the reader a picture in a fourth of the space of a journal article. In poetry, every single word is necessary and critical. So they're going to use strong, crisp words to get their point across. Your main problem with poetry is finding good poetry. You're going to want something between Shakespeare and a drunk tweet. Poetryfoundation.org has some really good poetry choices, and it also has a wide range of poetry and a lot of articles about the poets themselves. Some of the newer poetry I find is really good, and some of it is just weird social media garbage. I enjoy really classic, usually gothic, usually dark poetry. I enjoy something really painful. You can find some really good poets on Instagram by using hashtag #IGPoets or IGPoetry, poets of Instagram, poetry of Instagram. I just have to warn you that there's a lot of poetry in there, and some of it is really fantastic, and some of it is just adults that never got past the phase of writing really emo high school poetry. Either way, you can find some good poetry online, or just go to your local bookstore and pick up a book, whatever works. The third text I'm going to recommend is an academic textbook. Now, you don't have to go join a college class or anything like that, and it doesn't have to be related to English in any way. First, you need to pick a topic you're interested in and just immerse yourself in that topic. I am a philosophy and theology graduate student at the moment, so all of the texts I'm reading are in that realm. The vocabulary in the textbooks are really out of my comfort zone, and so that forces me to learn new vocabulary to continue in the book. I have to spend time learning new words and understanding new concepts in order to understand the full text, and also my lectures. But because the books are in topics that I enjoy, I frequently run into these words more often than not. Last year, I could not tell you what metaphysics or epistemology or empirical meant, but because I've been reading these textbooks constantly, I now have a better understanding, and I can understand these vocabulary words much more. So let me make this clear. Don't pick up a biology book if you have no interest in biology and will never review biology terms ever again. Sometimes people like to build their vocabulary just to build their vocabulary, and they end up not building their vocabulary because they never review or revisit those words ever again. Read an academic textbook based on topics that you run into often. So if you and your friends talk about history a lot, or you debate like military strategies, first of all, call me, that sounds fun. Second of all, pick up an academic textbook because it will probably have more challenging vocabulary than what you're currently using now. And the last recommendation I have for reading is to read a book that is not in your genre that you write. If you love to write fantasy, go read something literary. If you love literary, go read something science fiction. If you love science fiction, go read something paranormal romance. Now, you don't have to spend a lot of time tearing apart these books. You don't really have to enjoy the plot or anything like that. Just pick up a random book and just kind of skim through it, go all the way through it if you can. There are books that I read for research, and books that I read for enjoyment, and books that I read for school, and etc., etc. You have to get comfortable with reading books for research and not actually caring that much about them. So for example, I write romance books, but I actually don't like romance books. So I will read through romance books incredibly quickly, not really caring about the plot or character depth or anything like that. But I usually do it just to kind of skim through and see if there's any vocabulary that I can use, what kind of plot points people who pick up these books enjoy. It's more like market research. But to be honest, I really don't enjoy those kind of books just because they don't have the philosophical depth that I'm into. I much prefer philosophical fiction or gothic novels, something like that. That's what I will read for enjoyment. Now, I will pick up some vocabulary and ideas there, But at the same time, I don't really stop and write things down because I'm more interested in reading for pleasure than I am for reading to get better as a writer. So let's move on to another way that you can improve your vocabulary by listening. I actually think reading is the best way to build vocabulary because you can see it and interact with it, and also because writing is so different from speaking. But there are a lot of good resources, and I usually recommend listening to some sort of podcast or lecture, something along the lines of what you're interested in outside of writing. What makes you a unique writer is your collection of interests. So usually when I'm listening to a podcast, I'm usually listening to something that has to do with philosophy or psychology, theology. I'll usually pick up something now and then about the military or the army or organized crime, gangsters, things like that. There's certain historical periods that I find really interesting, including like the Prohibition or ancient Korea. And so listening to all these kinds of podcasts on a regular basis on topics that I actually enjoy and can absorb gives me some new vocabulary, or at least reinforces the vocabulary that I've already learned previously. But you might be thinking, Deidre, you write books about romance. These podcasts have nothing to do with romance writing. Nope. However, these podcasts do offer me insights into humanity and people, which in turn helps me build better characters for my books. And the last tip I have for you to build your vocabulary is to write. Listen, this is free writing advice. I don't know what you were expecting. But when I say write, I don't just mean write your next project. So what you should do is challenge your writing by trying to mock another style of writing. A good way of doing this is to actually read for 15 minutes and then go write for 15 minutes in the same style as the writer. Writing directly after reading keeps you in that same mindset as the writer, and you'll find that it pushes your vocabulary a lot harder than if you were just writing on your own. I find that after I write directly after reading, I start to mimic the original author, and that pushes my vocabulary because I'm trying to think like someone else. And I try to meet their vocabulary level. So for example, it's really hard for me to write a high school romance scene after I've just read an article about philosophical behaviorism. Although I'm sure that would make it a very interesting romance scene. On the flip side, it's really hard for me to write a formal objection to Nietzsche's perceptions of Christianity after I've just read a werewolf romance novel that I downloaded off of BookBub out of morbid curiosity. Although also, that would be interesting. The trick is to read something that gets your mind trapped in a new style of language and then force yourself into that style of language. Now, when you go to write on your next work in progress, you can drop that style. You don't have to think about that style ever again. But you have picked up some new vocabulary that you can use in the future. You've also pushed your writing style a little bit more, and that will reflect in your writing in the future as you slowly progress as a writer. For an added bonus, you can read your essays or the essays of that author aloud, and that will also build your vocabulary as you're speaking. Now, how long will it take for you to learn new vocabulary? Well, that's different for every person. According to ThoughtCo, you need to review that word 17 times before it actually starts to stick. I'll link that article below, but I have to say that during my philosophy classes and metaphysics classes and that sort of jazz, I've come in contact with the same word over and over and over again, and it took me a really long time for it to finally settle into my brain. I think I personally need more than 17 times to learn a vocabulary word. When you're building vocabulary, you have to remember it's not a race against other people. It's just you trying to improve your vocabulary to become better as a writer. Trust me, there are many people with all the vocabulary in the universe, and they are garbage writers. There are textbooks I have read that are full of the most expensive vocabulary you can possibly think of, but none of the readers understand what the writer is saying, so is it really worth it? Remember, communicating to your reader is the most important. So for me, I technically have lower vocabulary than most native English speakers, but I don't really let that bother me because I have the words that I need to communicate what I want. So a couple things I'll say: if your vocabulary is not improving, it's probably for one of two reasons. One, you're just not using that vocabulary. So when I was in college, I used to try to learn vocabulary by taking random words from dictionary.com and placing them in my poetry. I thought it was a brilliant idea until I came back a year later and I had no idea what I had written. That's because I never used the vocabulary ever again after using it in that poem. The second reason is probably just because you're trying to hoard vocabulary words. Here's the thing, having more vocabulary doesn't make you a better writer. Writing a lot makes you a better writer. You can buy all the paint in the world, from the cheapest, most horrible paint to the most expensive, best quality paint possible. But all of that paint doesn't make you a better painter. It just makes you a paint hoarder. And I think people do that with vocabulary words as well. They have all of these vocabulary words that they never use and they never learn how to put it into their writing effectively. And so they're just word hoarders. So one of the things I notice a lot in Korean textbooks that are supposed to be teaching English is that they use a lot of academic vocabulary, but their sentences are nonsense. So when my Korean students come in and give me these books, I have to tell them that I have no idea what this person is trying to say because this is not how you use any of these words. And English speakers are just as guilty as this, so I am not targeting Korean textbooks on English. English Academy textbooks do the same exact thing. Learn to use the vocabulary you have well. It's more important to use the words you know well than it is to use a million words badly. So I may write at a high school reading level, but I really don't care as long as my reader enjoys the book, it makes sense, I use the words correctly, and I create the imagery that I want to create. So just to recap, read a lot of books. Read a journal or magazine, read poetry, read an academic textbook, and read a book outside of your genre. Also, listen to podcasts, YouTube videos, news, anything that you're interested in that you will listen to often enough to review those words. And the last one, right. You're not going to become a better writer just by vocabulary hoarding. You need to go out and use what you have well. That'll be much more important than just collecting vocabulary. If you have any other ways that you personally build your vocabulary, let me know. I'm always interested in new techniques. If this was helpful, give it a like or share. Subscribe if you want to see more videos about how to subscribe. Subscribe if you want to see more videos about how to improve your creative writing. I will see you tigers next time. Continue being beautiful beasts. I will see you later. Peace.